If someone had told me I would trade a $10 billion empire for one more minute with her, I would have laughed and gone back to work. The rain tapped softly against my umbrella as I stood in front of a gray marble headstone on a cold October morning. The cemetery sat on a quiet hill outside a small town in Vermont, nearly 300 miles from Manhattan and even farther from the man I used to be. My name is Ethan Blackwood. 5 years ago, financial magazines called me a visionary. News networks called me a genius. Investors called me unstoppable. Today, none of those titles mattered, because the only title I wanted was the one I could never earn back. Her favorite person. A gust of wind swept across the hillside, carrying the scent of wet grass and fallen leaves. I stared at the name carved into the stone. Claire Morgan. The letters looked unchanged, just as they had every week since I first came here. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single white rose. It was already damp from the rain. Claire always preferred white flowers. She used to say they looked honest. I placed the rose carefully at the base of the headstone and lowered myself onto the wet ground without caring that my $1,000 coat would be ruined. 5 years ago, I would have cared. 5 years ago, I cared about everything except the woman who loved me. The silence around me felt heavier than the rain. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. 11 slow notes. Claire loved church bells. She said they reminded her that no matter how busy life became, people still needed moments to stop and listen. I never listened. Not really. I listened to quarterly earnings. I listened to market forecasts. I listened to lawyers, investors, analysts, and reporters. But I never listened when she told me she was lonely. I never listened when she said she missed me. I never listened when she begged me to slow down before it was too late. My phone vibrated inside my pocket. Instinctively, I pulled it out. The screen lit up with messages. Business offers. Interview requests. Opportunities. The same things that once controlled my life. I stared at the notifications for a moment before turning the phone completely off. The silence that followed felt strange. Peaceful. Painful. Necessary. You finally won, Claire, I whispered. My voice sounded smaller than I remembered. I learned how to put the phone down. A sad smile touched my lips. The kind of smile that arrives years too late. Rainwater slid down the polished stone as clouds drifted overhead. I sat there longer than I planned to, replaying memories that never stopped visiting me. Her laugh, her green eyes, the way she always carried a sketchbook wherever she went, the way she looked at me before everything fell apart. People think losing money is devastating. They think watching an empire collapse is the worst thing a person can experience. They are wrong. Because the day I lost Claire Morgan, I discovered there are things in this world that money can never buy back. And by the time I understood that lesson, it had already cost me everything. The first headline appeared 3 days after Claire disappeared. I still remember the exact moment because it was the first time in 15 years that I walked into my office and did not care about making money. The television mounted on the wall of the executive conference room flashed red banners across the screen while reporters spoke with excitement about market uncertainty. Blackwood Technologies had lost nearly $8 billion in value before noon. Investors were panicking. Analysts were speculating. Financial experts were predicting disaster. None of it mattered to me. I sat alone at the far end of a 30-foot conference table, staring at a photograph on my phone. Claire stood on a beach somewhere along the Maine coast. Wind pushed strands of blonde hair across her face while she laughed at whoever had taken the picture. Me. I had taken it 2 summers earlier. Back when I still believed there would always be another vacation. Another weekend. Another anniversary dinner. Another chance to make things right. A sharp knock interrupted my thoughts. The conference room door opened, and my chief financial officer stepped inside, carrying a stack of reports. His tie was crooked. His face looked pale. The man had not slept. Neither had I. "Ethan, we need to talk," he said. I nodded without looking away from the photograph. "The board is concerned." "Let them be concerned." He hesitated. "We lost another 12% this morning." I finally looked up. "Did you find her?" He blinked in confusion. "What? Claire?" His shoulders dropped slightly. No, silence settled between us. For months, people had spoken to me about stock prices, acquisition deals, earnings forecasts, and investor confidence. Now there was only one question I wanted answered. Where was Claire Morgan? Nobody seemed to know. She had left her apartment, left her job, left the city. It was as if she had simply stepped out of the life we shared and vanished into the world. I stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of people moved below like tiny shadows between skyscrapers. Somewhere out there was the woman who once waited hours for me to finish meetings. The woman who used to leave handwritten notes in my briefcase because she knew I never answered personal messages. The woman I convinced myself would always be there. My phone rang. The screen displayed a familiar name. Chairman of the board. I declined the call. A few seconds later it rang again. Then again. I turned the device completely off. Behind me, my chief financial officer released a long breath. The board is considering emergency measures, he said quietly. They think you are distracted. I laughed. It sounded empty, even to me. Distracted. That word almost felt funny. Losing focus during a meeting was distraction. Forgetting a deadline was distraction. Spending every waking hour wondering whether the woman you loved was safe was something else entirely. Outside, dark clouds gathered above the city skyline. Rain streaked the glass. I pressed my forehead against the cool window and closed my eyes. Somewhere deep inside, I felt something shifting, cracking, breaking. For years I had built an empire designed to survive every possible threat. Competition, recession, failure. But I had never prepared for the possibility that success itself might cost me the one person who made it worth having. People always assume extraordinary love stories begin with some dramatic moment. A chance encounter, a grand gesture, a perfect coincidence. Ours began with a spilled cup of coffee and a woman who refused to be impressed by my bank account. 3 years before everything fell apart, I was standing in line at a small bookstore cafe in Brooklyn, answering emails while pretending to listen to a conference call. The place smelled like roasted coffee beans and old paper. Rain tapped against the windows. My assistant had spent the entire morning reminding me that I was already 15 minutes behind schedule. Then someone bumped into my shoulder. Hot coffee splashed across the front of my white shirt. I looked up, irritated and ready to blame whoever had destroyed a shirt that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. Instead, I saw Claire. She stood frozen in front of me holding an empty paper cup and a sketchbook tucked beneath one arm. Her cheeks turned pink. "Oh my God. I am so sorry," she said. I remember staring at her for a second longer than necessary. Not because she looked like a model. She did not. Not because she was dressed in expensive clothes. She was not. I stared because she looked real. No performance. No calculation. No hidden agenda. Just genuine embarrassment. She reached into her bag and pulled out a handful of napkins. "Here. Let me help." I almost laughed. Nobody helped me. People worked for me, admired me, needed something from me. But nobody simply helped. "It is fine," I said. "I can buy another shirt." The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Her expression changed instantly. Not angry, not impressed, just unimpressed. "That is a terrible answer," she said. "Why?" "Because some things are worth more than money." Then she handed me the napkins and walked away before I could respond. I spent the next 10 minutes thinking about that sentence. A week later, I found myself back at the same bookstore. Not because I needed a book. Not because I wanted coffee. Because I wanted to see her again. Claire was sitting near the back window sketching something in a notebook. Sunlight spilled across the table. She looked peaceful, like someone who had figured out a secret the rest of the world missed. That afternoon turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekend walks. Weekend walks turned into 3 years. Somewhere between her terrible taste in movies and her obsession with roadside diners, she became the center of my life without me realizing it. The strange part was that Claire never cared about my success. She cared whether I was happy, whether I slept enough, whether I remembered to call my mother on her birthday, whether I looked at sunsets instead of stock charts once in a while. Looking back now, I realize she spent years trying to teach me how to live. And I spent years believing I had more important things to do. Standing in my office years later, staring out at the gray Manhattan skyline while rain rolled down the glass, I finally understood something painful. Claire Morgan had never wanted a billionaire. She had only wanted Ethan. And somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be him. The first time Claire told me she felt invisible, I was answering emails while she sat 3 feet away from me. We were in a small diner outside Hartford during a weekend road trip she had planned for months. The kind of place with red vinyl booths, endless coffee refills, and a waitress who called everyone sweetheart. Claire loved places like that. She said they reminded her that life did not have to be complicated to be meaningful. I barely looked up from my phone. Looking back, I wish I could remember what email seemed so important. I wish I could remember the deal, the client, the meeting, the crisis. But I cannot. That is the cruel thing about misplaced priorities. The things you sacrifice people for usually disappear. The people do not. They stay in your memory forever. Claire stirred cream into her coffee and watched rain slide down the window beside our booth. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Of course." I answered automatically while scrolling through messages. "Are you happy?" That finally made me look up. "What kind of question is that?" She smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "A simple one." I leaned back. "I have everything I worked for." "That is not what I asked." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The diner buzzed softly around us. Silverware clinked. Country music played somewhere near the kitchen. Ordinary life continued while something important slipped through my fingers without me noticing. "I think I am happy," I finally said. Claire nodded slowly. "You think?" I laughed. "What is this about?" She looked down at her coffee. "Nothing." But it was not nothing. It was never nothing. Over the next year, moments like that became more frequent. Small conversations. Small disappointments. Small silences that grew larger every month. Claire never demanded expensive gifts. Never asked for luxury vacations. Never cared about private jets or penthouses or exclusive events. She wanted breakfast together on Sunday mornings. She wanted walks without phone calls interrupting them. She wanted me to be present when we were in the same room. The tragedy was that she was asking for things I could have given her easily. They cost nothing. Yet somehow those became the things I withheld. One evening, she waited for me at a restaurant for nearly 2 hours. By the time I arrived, the candles had nearly burned down. Her dinner was cold. Her smile looked tired. "I am sorry," I said as I slid into the chair. The meeting ran late. Claire stared at me for a long moment. "Every meeting runs late, Ethan." I opened my mouth to explain. She gently raised a hand. "You do not have to convince me anymore. I already know where I rank." The words hit harder than any criticism I had ever received from investors, competitors, or reporters. Yet even then, I did not fully understand. I reached across the table and took her hand. "Things will slow down soon." She looked at our hands for several seconds before meeting my eyes. "That is what you said last year." Outside the restaurant, snow drifted through the city lights. Inside, I smiled and promised her everything would get better. And for the first time since I met Claire Morgan, I saw that she no longer believed me. The day everything changed began like every other day I had ignored her. My calendar was packed from 6 in the morning until nearly midnight. Investors were flying in from California. A major acquisition was entering its final stage. Every minute had already been assigned a purpose before I even opened my eyes. Claire was standing in the kitchen when I came downstairs. Early sunlight poured through the windows. The smell of coffee filled the room. She wore an oversized sweater and held a small envelope in her hands. I remember that detail because I would spend years wishing I had paid more attention to it. "Can we talk tonight?" she asked softly. I glanced at my watch. "Of course." "Promise." A strange expression crossed her face. Hope mixed with caution. The look of someone who had been disappointed before but still wanted to believe. "I promise." She smiled. Not the bright smile I fell in love with. A smaller one. "Careful." Then she handed me the envelope. "Do not forget." I slipped it into my briefcase without opening it. "I will look at it later." "Okay." That was all she said. Just okay. By noon, I had already forgotten about the envelope. By 3 o'clock, I was negotiating contracts in a conference room overlooking Manhattan. By 6 o'clock, I was answering questions from reporters. At 8:30, my assistant reminded me that I was supposed to leave for dinner. Claire had made reservations weeks earlier. I looked at the clock, then at the documents spread across the table, then at the dozen people waiting for my decision. "Cancel it," I said. "Tell her something came up." My assistant hesitated. "Ethan, this is the 3rd time this month. Just handle it." The conversation ended there. Or so I thought. Around 10 that night, I finally walked into the penthouse. The city lights glittered beyond the windows. The apartment felt unusually quiet. "Claire." No answer. I loosened my tie and walked through the living room. Then I saw the envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. My name was written across the front in her handwriting. Suddenly I remembered. A cold feeling settled in my chest. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Ethan, I spent a long time believing that love meant being patient. I told myself things would get better when work slowed down. Then I told myself things would get better after the next deal. Then after the next promotion. Then after the next year. I kept waiting for our life to begin. Somewhere along the way, I realized I was waiting alone. I do not hate you. I do not blame you. But I cannot keep loving someone who only shows up when it is convenient. One day you will understand what matters most. I hope when that day comes, it is not too late. Claire. I read the letter 3 times before I noticed the apartment. Her sketchbooks were gone. Her favorite jacket was gone. The framed photograph from our trip to Maine was gone. The silence suddenly felt enormous. I grabbed my phone and called her immediately. Straight to voicemail. I called again, and again, and again. Nothing. Standing alone beneath the city lights, I felt fear for the first time in years. Not fear of failure. Not fear of losing money. Fear that the one person who had always waited for me had finally stopped waiting. The strange thing about regret is that it does not arrive all at once. It arrives in waves. The first wave hit me the morning after Claire left. I woke up reaching for her side of the bed. Cold sheets greeted my hand. The apartment felt unfamiliar without her. Too quiet. Too large. Too empty. I spent the next 3 days calling every friend she had ever mentioned. Every coworker. Every neighbor. Every contact in my phone who might know where she went. Nobody knew. Or if they did, they refused to tell me. By the 4th day, I convinced myself she just needed space. Claire had always been reasonable, kind, patient. She would cool off. She would answer eventually. That was the lie I told myself because the truth was harder to face. The truth was that I had spent years teaching her not to expect me. 1 week passed. Then 2. Her voicemail remained full. Her social media accounts went silent. The bookstore where we met had not seen her. The art center where she volunteered said she had resigned. It felt as though she had carefully erased every path that could lead back to her. Meanwhile, life kept demanding my attention. Meetings filled my calendar. Investors requested updates. The board expected leadership. Every morning I put on a suit and pretended everything was normal. Every night I returned to an apartment that no longer felt like home. One evening, I found myself standing in front of a small wooden box in the back of my closet. Claire had given it to me on my 35th birthday. I had never opened it. At the time, I told myself I was too busy. Later became next week. Next week became next month. Then I forgot it existed entirely. The box sat covered in dust. My stomach tightened as I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of small items. Ticket stubs from movies we watched together. Photographs from weekend trips. Notes written on napkins. Pressed flowers from hikes. Tiny fragments of a life Claire had been carefully preserving while I rushed past it. At the very bottom was an envelope. My name was written across the front. I unfolded the letter slowly. If you are reading this, it means you finally stopped running long enough to look inside. I laughed softly despite the ache in my chest. That sounded exactly like her. The letter continued for several pages. Stories. Memories. Little moments I had forgotten. The day we got lost in Maine and ended up eating lobster rolls beside a harbor. The night the power went out and we spent hours talking by candlelight. The morning she taught me how to make pancakes and nearly burned down the kitchen because we were both laughing too hard. By the time I reached the last page, my eyes were wet. The final sentence stopped me completely. Ethan, one day your success will stop growing. One day the meetings will end. One day the phone will stop ringing. When that happens, I hope you are standing beside someone you love, because that is the only achievement that lasts. I sat there for a long time staring at those words. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath the night sky. Inside, for the first time, I began to wonder whether Claire had not left because she stopped loving me. Maybe she left because she finally realized she deserved someone who knew how to love her back. 3 months after Claire left, I received the phone call that changed everything. It happened on a gray Thursday afternoon while I was sitting through a board meeting I could barely follow. Voices echoed around the conference room. Charts flashed across giant screens. Millions of dollars were being discussed. I could not remember a single word. My phone vibrated against the table. An unfamiliar Vermont number appeared on the screen. Normally, I ignored unknown calls. Something made me answer. Mr. Blackwood? A woman's voice asked. Yes. My name is Margaret Ellis. I believe I have information about Claire Morgan. Every sound in the room disappeared. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stood so quickly that several executives looked up in surprise. Where is she? I asked. Please, slow down. Is she okay? There was a pause. A long one. The kind that instantly fills a person with dread. Mr. Blackwood, I think it would be better if we spoke in person. Less than 4 hours later, I was on a private flight heading north through heavy clouds. The entire trip felt unreal. For months I had searched for answers. Now someone finally claimed to have one. Vermont greeted me with rain and cold wind. The town was small enough that most people probably knew each other by name. Margaret Ellis turned out to be the owner of a local bed and breakfast. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that somehow made me more nervous. We sat across from each other in a quiet dining room that smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. Claire stayed here briefly, Margaret said. My chest tightened. When? About 3 months ago. 3 months. The exact time since Claire disappeared from my life. Did she say where she was going? Margaret looked down at her hands. No. I felt frustration rising. Then why call me? She reached into a drawer beside her desk and removed a small notebook. Because she left this behind. I recognized it immediately. Claire's sketchbook. The blue cover was worn at the corners. My hands trembled as I accepted it. For a moment I could not even open it. The pages were filled with sketches. Trees. Mountains. Coffee shops. Strangers sitting on park benches. Ordinary moments transformed into art through Claire's eyes. Then I reached the final page. My breath caught. It was a drawing of me. Not the billionaire. Not the executive. Just Ethan. Sitting quietly by a lake. Looking peaceful. Looking happy. Underneath the sketch, she had written 6 words. The man I hope he becomes. I stared at the page until the ink blurred. She talked about you, Margaret said softly. Every day. She did. Margaret nodded. She loved you very much. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they shattered something inside me. Because if Claire still loved me, then why had she disappeared so completely? Why had she left no address, no message, no path back to her? Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, I turned another page and discovered something that made my stomach drop. Folded between the sheets was a newspaper clipping dated only 2 weeks earlier. Claire had not vanished 3 months ago. Somehow, somewhere, she was still moving, still running. And for the first time, I realized I was not searching for someone who had disappeared. I was searching for someone who did not want to be found. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking how much something would cost and started asking whether it mattered. The answer was always the same. If it brought me closer to Claire, it mattered. The newspaper clipping from her sketchbook became my only lead. It was a small article about a community art fair held in a town nearly 200 miles from where Margaret Ellis had last seen her. The article itself was insignificant. What caught my attention was a photograph in the corner. Most people would have overlooked it. I nearly did. But standing in the background beside a display of children's paintings was a woman wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. Her face was partially turned away. Yet I knew, after 3 years together, I would have recognized Claire anywhere. The next morning I canceled every meeting on my calendar. My assistant stared at me as though I had announced I was moving to Mars. The board will not like this, she warned. The board can wait. You have shareholders expecting answers. I picked up my coat. So do I. 6 hours later, I arrived in the small Pennsylvania town where the photograph had been taken. It was the kind of place Claire always loved. Tree-lined streets, family-owned shops, flower baskets hanging from old brick buildings. A place where people actually looked at one another instead of staring at screens. I spent the entire afternoon walking from business to business, carrying a copy of the photograph. Most people shook their heads politely. Some barely looked. Others offered directions that led nowhere. By sunset, I was exhausted. I sat alone on a park bench watching children play near a fountain. For the first time since beginning my search, doubt crept into my mind. Maybe I was chasing shadows. Maybe Claire wanted a life that did not include me anymore. Maybe I deserved that. An elderly man lowered himself onto the bench beside me. He held a paper cup of coffee and smelled faintly of sawdust. You look lost, he said. I laughed quietly. That obvious? Only to people who have been lost before. We sat in silence for a moment. Then his eyes drifted toward the photograph in my hand. Looking for someone? Yes. He studied the picture briefly. I know her. My heart nearly stopped. You do? She volunteered at the community center for a few weeks. Every muscle in my body tightened. Where is she now? The old man shrugged. No idea. Nice woman, though. Always helping people. Especially kids. Kids. Art. Community centers. Suddenly a pattern began to emerge. Claire was not hiding randomly. She was moving toward the kind of life she always dreamed about. A life built around people rather than profit. The old man stood and tossed his empty cup into a trash can. Before leaving, he looked back at me. "If you find her, do not waste the opportunity." "I will not." He smiled sadly. Most men say that after they learn the lesson. The lucky ones learn it before. After he walked away, I sat there long after dark staring at the photograph. Somewhere out there, Claire was building a life without me. And for the first time, I realized my search was no longer about convincing her to come back. It was about proving that the man she left behind no longer existed. The collapse did not begin with a dramatic announcement. It began with silence. The kind of silence that spreads through conference rooms when people stop believing in the person at the head of the table. 2 weeks after my trip to Pennsylvania, I returned to Manhattan long enough to discover how much damage absence could cause. My office looked exactly the same. The skyline still stretched beyond the windows. The assistants still moved through hallways carrying tablets and schedules. But something had changed. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Executives avoided eye contact. The confidence that once surrounded me had vanished. By noon, I was sitting in front of the board of directors. 12 people, 12 serious faces, 12 individuals who had once trusted me without question. "Your attention has been elsewhere," the chairman said carefully. I almost laughed. Elsewhere. That was one way to describe it. "The company remains profitable," I replied. "For now," another board member added. Reports slid across the polished table. Declining investor confidence. Delayed projects. Competitors gaining ground. Missed opportunities. Numbers filled page after page. The strange thing was that none of it surprised me. For years I had sacrificed everything to protect this company. Now I had done the opposite, and the company had noticed. "We need stability," the chairman continued. "The market needs stability." I looked around the room. These people were not villains. They were not betraying me. They were protecting what they believed mattered most. The same mistake I had spent years making. After the meeting ended, I stood alone in my office watching evenings settle over Manhattan. My phone buzzed constantly. Financial journalists wanted statements. Investors wanted reassurance. Advisors wanted emergency meetings. Instead of answering, I opened Claire's sketchbook. The worn blue cover felt strangely comforting in my hands. I turned to the page with the drawing she made of me beside the lake. "The man I hope he becomes." For a long moment, I stared at those words. Then my office door opened. My chief financial officer stepped inside. He looked exhausted. "There is something else," he said quietly. "A competitor just announced a major acquisition." I nodded. "I heard. The stock is falling again." Outside, lights flickered on across the city. Thousands of windows glowed against the darkening sky. "Do you know what Claire used to tell me?" I asked. He blinked. "What?" "She used to say that every person eventually discovers what they worship." Confusion crossed his face. "I do not understand." Neither did I. Not completely. Not yet. But I was beginning to. Because as billions of dollars shifted hands and headlines questioned my future, my thoughts remained fixed on a woman volunteering in small towns and teaching children how to paint. Somewhere along the way, the things that once terrified me had lost their power. The company was struggling. The board was nervous. Competitors were circling. Yet none of those fears felt as heavy as the possibility of never finding Claire again. And that realization frightened me for an entirely different reason. Because for the first time in my life, I was no longer sure whether saving the empire was the goal. The official end of my old life arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. There were no flashing cameras, no dramatic speeches, no headlines breaking across giant screens. Just a conference room, a stack of documents, and a decision that everyone in the room already knew was coming. I sat at the head of the table while the board members avoided looking directly at me. Outside, Manhattan disappeared behind a curtain of gray rain. Inside, the future I had spent 2 decades building quietly slipped away. The chairman cleared his throat. His voice sounded almost apologetic. "Ethan, this is not personal." I nodded. People always say that when something is deeply personal. A folder slid across the table. Restructuring plans. Leadership changes. Emergency measures designed to restore investor confidence. The words blurred together. In simple terms, the board no longer trusted me to lead the company. Months earlier, that realization would have devastated me. Now I felt strangely calm. "You can fight this," one board member said. "Many shareholders still support you." I looked down at Claire's sketchbook resting beside the folder. I had started carrying it everywhere. The contrast almost made me smile. For years, my briefcase contained contracts worth billions of dollars. Now, the most valuable thing I owned was a collection of drawings from the woman I could not stop searching for. "No," I said quietly. "I will not fight it." Several heads lifted in surprise. "Are you sure?" the chairman asked. I looked around the room. Most of these people had spent years helping me build something extraordinary. They expected anger, resistance, negotiation. Instead, I felt tired. Not physically tired, spiritually tired. Tired of measuring every decision by profit. Tired of believing success could solve loneliness. Tired of chasing more while losing what mattered most. I am sure. The meeting ended 30 minutes later. Just like that, I walked out of the company that had defined nearly my entire adult life. The elevator ride to the lobby felt surreal. 28 floors. Less than a minute. 20 years reduced to a brief descent. When the doors opened, a young security guard nodded politely. He probably had no idea who I was. Strangely, that felt liberating. Outside, rain soaked the sidewalks. People rushed past carrying umbrellas and coffee cups. Nobody stopped. Nobody stared. Nobody cared that Ethan Blackwood was no longer the man he used to be. For the first time in years, I was simply another person walking through the city. My phone rang. It was my real estate advisor. "We should discuss the penthouse," he said, "and the Hamptons property." Another call followed. Then another. Lawyers, accountants, financial managers. Pieces of my old world slowly breaking apart. By evening, I sat alone inside the penthouse overlooking the city one final time. Boxes lined the walls. Half the shelves stood empty. The place no longer felt impressive. It felt hollow. My eyes drifted toward a framed photograph Claire once took during a trip to Maine. The sunset behind us glowed gold across the water. We looked happy, younger, unaware of how fragile happiness can be when neglected. I picked up the photograph and slipped it carefully into a box. Then I looked around the apartment and realized something unexpected. I had lost the company. I was losing the fortune. I was losing the life everyone envied. Yet the only loss that still hurt was the one that had happened months ago when a woman carrying a sketchbook walked out the door and stopped waiting for me to become the man she always believed I could be. 3 months later, I was living in a place smaller than my old office conference room. The apartment sat above a family-owned hardware store in a quiet town in upstate New York. The floors creaked. The radiator rattled at night. The kitchen barely had enough space for 2 people. Claire would have loved it. That thought visited me almost every day. At first, the adjustment felt humiliating. I had spent years surrounded by assistants, drivers, and schedules designed to remove inconvenience from my life. Suddenly, I was carrying my own groceries, assembling my own furniture, and waiting in line at the local laundromat on Saturday mornings. The strange part was how quickly those things stopped feeling like burdens. One afternoon, the owner of the hardware store knocked on my door. His name was Walter. He was 72 years old and walked with a slight limp. "You busy?" he asked. I almost laughed. Nobody had asked me that question in years. Usually people assumed I was busy. Not particularly. "Good. The community center needs volunteers." Before I could answer, he handed me a flyer and walked away. That evening, I found myself standing inside a small building filled with folding chairs, paint supplies, and children working on art projects. The room smelled like crayons and fresh coffee. A young teacher greeted me with a smile. "You must be Ethan." I nodded awkwardly. "Walter sent me." "Then you are helping us set up tables." That was it. No discussion about my former company. No questions about my net worth. No recognition. Just tables. For the next 3 hours, I carried supplies, cleaned paintbrushes, and helped move furniture. Nobody cared who I used to be. They only cared whether I was useful. Driving home that night, I thought about Claire. She had spent years trying to teach me this lesson. The value of showing up. The value of helping. The value of being present. Not because there was a reward. Not because there was profit. Simply because people matter. Weeks turned into months. I continued volunteering. I met teachers, retirees, single parents, and small business owners. People whose lives would never appear on magazine covers, but who quietly improved the world every day. One snowy afternoon, a little girl handed me a drawing she had made during an art class. The picture showed a house, a tree, and 2 stick figures standing together beneath a bright yellow sun. "Do you like it?" she asked. "I do. You looked sad when you came here, she said matter-of-factly. You do not look as sad anymore. Children have a way of telling uncomfortable truths. That evening I carried the drawing home and pinned it above my kitchen table. As I stared at it, I realized something important. Losing everything had forced me to see things I never noticed when I was winning. Kindness, patience, community, time, the simple beauty of ordinary days. Claire understood those things long before I did. Somewhere out there, she was still living the kind of life she always believed mattered most. And for the first time since she left, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Not certainty, not success, hope. The call came on a warm spring afternoon while I was helping repaint a classroom at the community center. Blue paint covered my hands. Music drifted softly from an old radio in the corner. A year earlier, I would have been sitting in a glass tower reviewing quarterly reports. Now I was standing on a ladder, trying not to spill paint on the floor. I liked this version of my life more than I expected. My phone rang from inside my jacket pocket. I almost ignored it. Then I saw Margaret Ellis's name on the screen. My heart immediately sped up. Margaret never called without a reason. Margaret. Ethan. Her voice sounded unusually emotional. I think I found her. The ladder suddenly felt unsteady beneath me. I climbed down carefully and stepped outside into the sunlight. What do you mean? Someone from a neighboring town recognized the photograph I showed them. I closed my eyes. For a moment I could not speak. Where is she? There is a youth arts center about 30 miles from here. They say a woman named Claire Morgan has been teaching classes there for nearly a year. Nearly a year. While I had been searching across states and cities, Claire had quietly built a new life. After ending the call, I sat alone on a bench outside the building. Children laughed somewhere nearby. Birds moved through the trees overhead. The world felt unchanged. Yet everything inside me had shifted. 2 days later, I drove to the small town Margaret mentioned. The roads wound through rolling hills and green fields. It looked exactly like the kind of place Claire once described during our long conversations. Peaceful, honest, real. The arts center occupied an old brick building near the town square. Murals covered the outside walls. Bright colors stretched across every surface. Children carried sketchbooks in and out of the front entrance. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. For a long moment, I simply sat there. After all this time, after all the searching, I was finally here. Then I saw her. Claire stepped through the front doors carrying a stack of paintings. Sunlight caught her blonde hair. She laughed at something a child said beside her. The sound reached me even through the closed windows. It felt like hearing a favorite song after years of silence. She looked healthy, happy, at peace. More importantly, she looked free. The realization hurt more than I expected, because I immediately understood something difficult. Claire had not been waiting for rescue. She had not spent the last year hoping I would find her. She had built a meaningful life without me. For several minutes, I watched from across the street. Not because I was afraid to approach her, because I wanted to see who she had become. The answer was obvious. She had become exactly the person she always dreamed of being. A teacher, a mentor, a source of kindness. The version of herself she never had room to become while living in my shadow. Then, as if sensing something, Claire looked up. Her eyes scanned the street. For one impossible moment, they met mine. Time stopped. Neither of us moved. The distance between us was only a few yards, yet it felt larger than an ocean. And in Claire's expression, I saw something that terrified me more than rejection. I saw recognition. I saw surprise. But I did not see the certainty that she wanted me there. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The sounds of the town continued around us. Children laughed. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Wind stirred the leaves overhead. Yet all I could focus on was Claire. A year of searching. A year of questions. A year of regret. And suddenly she was standing right there. Claire looked down briefly before saying something to the child beside her. The young girl nodded and ran back inside the art center carrying her paintings. Then Claire crossed the street toward me. Every step felt unreal. When she finally stopped a few feet away, I realized she looked different. Not older. Not distant. Stronger. Like someone who had finally built a life she was proud of. "Hello, Ethan," she said softly. Hearing my name in her voice nearly broke me. "Hello, Claire." Silence settled between us. Not an angry silence. Not an uncomfortable one. Just two people standing in the space created by choices they could never undo. Claire glanced toward the arts center. "How did you find me?" I laughed quietly. It took a year. A small smile touched her lips. That sounds about right. For the first time, I saw a hint of the woman I remembered. The woman who could always find humor inside difficult moments. I searched everywhere, I admitted. Vermont, Pennsylvania, places I never knew existed. Her eyes softened. Why? The question should have been simple. Yet it felt larger than anything I had ever been asked. Because a year earlier, I would have answered differently. A year earlier, I would have talked about love, about losing her, about wanting another chance. But standing there, I finally understood the truth. Because you were right, I said. Claire blinked. About what? Everything. The wind lifted a few strands of her hair. You spent years trying to teach me how to live. I just never listened. For a moment she looked away. I did not leave to teach you a lesson, Ethan. I know. My voice grew quieter. You left because you deserved better. Her eyes met mine again. Neither of us spoke. Finally, Claire asked the question I had feared most. What happens now? I looked around the town square. Children carrying sketchbooks. Neighbors greeting each other by name. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. The kind of life I once believed was too small for me. The kind of life that now seemed priceless. That depends on you, I said. Surprise crossed her face. Me? I nodded. I did not come here to convince you to return to my life. I smiled gently. I came here because I needed you to know that you changed it. Claire stared at me for several seconds. Then tears filled her eyes. Not tears of sadness. Something softer. Something warmer. You really are different, she whispered. I laughed. It took me long enough. We stood there talking until the sun began to set. Not about the past. Not about mistakes. About books. Students. Community projects. Small things. Real things. As the sky turned gold above the town, I realized something remarkable. For the first time since I met Claire Morgan, I was not trying to impress her. I was simply enjoying being beside her. When we finally started walking toward the arts center together, our hands brushed briefly. Neither of us rushed. Neither of us forced promises about the future. Some stories do not end with grand gestures. Some end with two people choosing to take the next step together. Years ago, I thought wealth meant owning more than everyone else. I was wrong. Real wealth is having someone who sees who you are, believes in who you can become, and gives you a reason to become better. And as the evening sunlight followed us down that quiet street, I finally understood that the most valuable thing I ever found was never money. It was the chance to become the man she always believed I could be.